Hello, good to see everyone. I'm going to resume our reading in Calvin's wonderful sermon, heart-searching sermon, on valuing God's church and the freedom to worship Him. Again, this is taken from this volume, Faith Unfeigned, a Banner of Truth production. And I'm reading on page 56, beginning with the next little division that he has to this sermon, entitled, The Church's Ministry is Permanent, Not Provisional. And so here we go for another installment of this, or from rather, this fine sermon. It may be objected that David is speaking figuratively. That is, when David speaks about going up to the house of the Lord, how that he's longed. He's now referenced Psalm 42, that great psalm, how my soul longs to be up with the saints, worshiping you in the corporate context, just as the hart or the deer pants for water. And he says it may be objected that David's speaking figuratively for his own time, when God ruled his people as one might rule small children, as Paul himself declares in Galatians 4. And that, therefore, his longing for the temple does not apply to us today, since we are likened to those who have left childhood behind and have grown up. 1 Corinthians 13 and Ephesians 4. My answer first would be to point out that our need to be taught by sermons, strengthened by the sacraments, and exercised both in public prayer and in the confession of our faith, is something we share with the fathers of old. That's the tenor of so many promises which we mainly find in the prophet Isaiah, where God announces that his church will have children without number, and that having conceived and begotten them, she will nurture them. He's referencing here Isaiah chapter 60, a passage, Lord willing, we shall all be able to consider together in a few weeks. There can be no doubt that this applies to the kingdom of Jesus Christ and to our own time. Thus, God expressly commits his children to the bosom of the church. Why is this, if not because of the ordered ministry which he has appointed to gather his children together, in flocks, as it were? The same prophet uses a fine analogy to express this idea when again in chapter 60, Isaiah being the prophet, he describes Christians as doves returning in their various flights to the dovecote. Isaiah 60, verse 8. Now, can this dovecote be anything else than every place where God's word is preached, the sacraments administered, and God's name invoked? The fact is that those who think they are tough enough to do without external guidance have no regard for their condition. Now I'm going to reread that sentence because we all need that one, because we all chafe under the leadership and guidance of people, whether it's in our civil affairs or in our ecclesial affairs. The fact is that those who think they are tough enough, we could substitute there smart enough or smarter than. Those who think they are tough enough to do without external guidance have no regard for their condition. Why, after all, did God appoint the sacraments for our use, except that, clothed as we are in our bodies, we are too dense to appreciate spiritual things unless we have visible signs to help us? The angels fully possess the reality of the sacraments, and that is enough for them. God, however, must descend much lower to where we are on account of our guidance, or rather on account of our ignorance. Let giddy Christians cast off the body and transform themselves into angels from heaven. They can then dispense with these trifling aids which mean so little to them, whereas all who acknowledge that they are merely human have no choice but to accept the normal pattern which God lays down for all who are his. It is true that God's grace is not contained, nor the power of his Spirit enclosed either in the sacraments or in anything else external, so that he cannot work without means whenever he chooses. Here, however, we are considering that perpetual order which God has established in his church. and not his extraordinary acts, which are miraculous in character. When all is said and done, those who are without access to the sacraments, and who cannot freely invoke God's name, but who, blind to their miserable plight, heave not a single sigh, are more mindless than the brute beasts. I would add that if David in his own day and age had reason to describe God's temple as lovely, those who dwell in it as blessed, and himself as longing to enter the Lord's courts, we today should be more than doubly moved and provoked to follow his example. For what privileges did the temple possess that David so much missed, so as to lose all taste for life once they were gone? They were essentially the same as those we enjoy today, but as we know, they were dark shadows in which God displayed far less of the grace that is now visible to us. For God reveals himself so intimately to us in the ministry of the church that heaven itself is, in a manner of speaking, open to us. The sacraments do not point to Jesus Christ from afar, as happened under the law. They place him before our very eyes, so we would have to be utterly thankless if we did not prefer such blessings to all that David was once able to find in Zion's temple. We are no longer in the temple courts of which David speaks. There is no longer any hanging veil to keep us from the sanctuary. In short, we little revere God's endless mercies to us if our yearning for him cannot at least match that of David's. What I have said so far is by way of very basic teaching. The application will follow in due course. It remains for us to look more closely at David's yearning, which is the norm we should imitate. One thing, he says, I've asked of the Lord. By one thing he implies that it has become so much his chief concern that all else is left behind, as if quite forgotten. Was this because he had fulfilled every wish, so that only this one thing was missing? On the contrary, he was an exile from the land of his birth, banished even from his father's house and from the companionship of relatives and friends. He'd been stripped of all he had, deprived of his once great dignities and honors. His wife had been taken from him. Here then was a man in utter and total distress, yet he longs for one thing only, to have entry into the temple. I want to add a little side note here. I have observed many times, our elders have observed, and we've prayed about this, how strange it is that when people come under the greatest pressures, when people are distressed the most, when people have the most problems in their life, in today's church, they tend to separate themselves from the church. They tend to grow marginal in their attendance to holy worship. When in fact, if we imitated David, and I'm going to add here, if we had the grace of the Spirit living in us like David, we would be drawn to public worship, not pushed away from it. He longs for one thing only, even in the midst of all of his afflictions, to have entry into the temple. How much more so should we, Calvin says. When, moreover, in another psalm, he thanks God for all his benefits to him, food and drink, rest and bodily comfort, he ends by declaring that he will dwell forever in God's house, proving that despite his feelings of ease and enjoyment, his dearest ambition is to be in the assembly of believers and thus to attain the supreme blessing. Whether then in trouble or prosperity, David was at all times resolved to enjoy the freedom God had given the children of Israel, which is no small virtue on his part. There are some we know who, when beset by hardship and distress, remember God, but as soon as that's behind them and all is well, that's the end of it. What is worse, they kick out at him like horses which have been too well fed. Others, when in adversity, are so upset and angry with God that they cannot bear to hear him spoken of. Is David overcome by so many afflictions that he seems to be the most wretched creature on earth? Even so, There is no sorrow that can make him scorn or bridle at the mention of God's name. It is rather the only name which brings him consolation. Then, too, although he cannot think of God without grieving that he is banished from his house and denied the sacraments and other rites of faith, his chief pleasure is to lament their loss. Are all his difficulties behind him? Has he overcome his enemies, so that he enjoys peace in his kingdom and is held in awe by all? Has he the means to satisfy every sensual delight? Whatever the case, he holds fast to his word. He will be truly happy only when he enters the temple and enjoys the church's ordered ministry. Hence we see that in asking one thing of God, he was making no vain boast. It was so dear to him that he would have given up everything else in exchange. It's a good place for us to stop and ask ourselves if we are anywhere close to David in our spirituality, in our holiness, in our love for Christ and his church. There we stop for the day. Look forward to the next time. God bless.